neutrinos from supernova, whether it be from oscillations or looking at nucleosynthesis, possibilities for neutrino detection, which we've actually done with 1987A, their effects on explosion dynamics, et cetera. But there's actually a really large buildup of neutrino emission in the hours and days before the supernova itself. So you can watch in this plot over here, you can see the electron neutrinos and the electron antineutrinos both have pretty large buildups right before collapse, which is over here. Not to the level of the supernova burst, but within or a couple orders of magnitude. So this buildup is relatively unstudied, especially as compared to the neutrinos that come after the burst. So as the star is evolving, the core becomes hotter and denser, and the processes that produce neutrinos are sensitive to the temperature and density. And based on just the numbers produced on this plot before, detectability seems possible. But to really study that, you need to look at the spectral information for the neutrinos. So there are two main categories of processes that produce neutrinos in the pre-supernova. One is beta processes, so beta decay and electron and positron capture, and the other is thermal processes. And the main focus of previous work has been thermal processes. The main thermal processes are pair annihilation, so electron and positron annihilates to form a neutrino-antineutrino pair of any flavor. Photoneutrino process, which is kind of a modified Compton scattering that winds up with, again, a neutrino-antineutrino pair, or plasmon decay, where an excitation in the plasma will spontaneously decay to a neutrino-antineutrino pair. There's also Bremsstrahlung and recombination, but these are really subdominant in the temperatures and densities that occur in the star. And a group led by Ito in the early to mid-90s looked at these thermal processes in great detail and came up with analytic formulas to describe all of these. So they looked, like I said, they found analytic formulas to calculate the emissivities for thermal processes. So just to clarify, the emissivity is the energy released as neutrinos from the star. And they mapped out the areas of dominance for the various thermal processes. So in a map of temperature and density, like you can see over here, we've got recombination way down here, photoneutrino process, pair annihilation up here in the top, plasma, Bremsstrahlung. And you can see this red curve shows the central temperature and density for the evolution of a 20 solar mass star. And you can see that after carbon burning, most of this curve is up in this pair-dominated space. So for most of the large star's lifetime, late lifetime, the pair process dominates. So people who've looked at pre-supernovas before really focused on the pair neutrinos. Back in 2003, 2004, a group led by Olek looked into this. They assumed that all of the neutrinos from these large stars were coming from pair annihilation, and given the results of Ito, this seems like a good first step. They looked specifically at a 20 solar mass star 1 kiloparsec away and looked at what you could see in various current and next generation detectors. So the exciting ones are down here at the bottom, looking at Super K, this is Juno actually, and Hyper K. You see that you can get tens of events perhaps in a current generation detector from a star like this, but in next generation detectors you could see hundreds of events. So this is not like huge statistics, but it is something. More recently, in the last year or so, the Camland group put out a paper about what their detector specifically could do. Again, they focused just on pair annihilation neutrinos, and they found that for a 25 solar mass star at 660 parsecs away, you could detect the neutrinos from that star at three signal level. So again, that's pretty exciting, especially since we're only considering one avenue for neutrino production. Another paper in the last year or so was put out by Kato et al. And they looked to see if you could tell the difference between different progenitors. So they looked at one smaller star, about 8 solar masses, with an oxygen neon core, and then 2 larger stars that have iron cores, and wanted to see if you could tell the difference between them just based on the neutrinos before the supernova. They looked at pair annihilation in particular, but they also included the plasmon decay. And they found that discrimination could be possible in next generation detectors. So this plot over here shows the cumulative number of events as a function of time to collapse in hyper K. And the 2 larger stars are up here, and you can see you get on the order of 100 events. And then for the small star, you're getting obviously way less. So just based on the fact that you'll see something in a larger star and not see something in the smaller star, this progenitor discrimination looks possible. So all of that work, though, has focused on the thermal neutrinos, because calculations of thermal neutrino emission is relatively straightforward. You write down the matrix element and then you do some integration. But there's a second category to explore, which is beta processes. So I'm assuming, since we're all nuclear physicists, we are familiar with beta processes. This gets complicated because there's lots of isotopes present in the core in late stages. And these processes produce just electron neutrinos and antineutrinos through decay and capture reactions on all of the isotopes that are present there. There was one paper that looked at this specifically in the pre-supernova domain here. Again, it was this Ojuzvolek group, and they assumed they didn't use a stellar evolution model. They assumed nuclear statistical equilibrium and then chose a single temperature density electron fraction point that's typical for a large star in silicon burning phase. And they plotted, so these red dotted curves are various thermal processes that were looked at before. And then the green curve, which you can hardly see because it's on top of the black curve, is the beta processes. So you can see that from this, it looks like beta processes are very important. They dominate over all of the thermal processes and are basically making up the entirety of the neutrino emission in these large stars. This is neutrinos and this is antineutrinos. So we looked at all of this previous work and said, well, nobody has really done a full calculation of all of the things going on. So that was our main goal, was to do full calculations of spectra and the emissivity for the dominant thermal processes, so pair annihilation, photoneutrino process, and plasma decay, but also include the beta processes. And our main focus was really on the inclusion of the beta processes, since they had been kind of neglected in the past. We used realistic stellar conditions that we got from the Stellar Evolution Code MESA, which is open source and anyone can go download it. And there's these references here talk a lot about what you can do with it. And then we looked at actually 4 different stellar masses and looked at different points in the evolution to compare how these different sized stars look compared to one another. So we looked at 15, 20, 25, and 30 solar masses in our full analysis, which is in the paper we just submitted, so that's not really available to see right now, but we're going to look at focus here on specifically the largest and the smallest, so the 15 and the 30 solar mass stars. So I mentioned that our main focus was on the beta spectrum, and really the shape of that spectrum is completely determined by the phase space of the electrons or positrons involved. So depending on whether they're incoming or outgoing, and you can just write it down pretty simply. And so this shape depends on the neutrino energy, the chemical potential, temperature, and the Q value, which you can define simply as the difference between the parent and the daughter masses and their excitation energies. The way we have it written here, there's these N values out here. These are just normalization factors so that our rates that we're calculating match rates from tables that we were using. So the hard part here is really finding this Q value, actually. In theory, it's easy to calculate because you can just write it down. It's the difference between masses and excitation energies. But in reality, we don't actually know what initial and final states are involved. And since it is a very hot and dense environment, there are lots of possibilities of what these initial and final states could be. So instead of trying to do it accounting for each and every potential combination, we defined an effective Q value, and that just is defined to be the value that reproduces the correct average energy. So basically, we calculate the spectrum and the average energy with some starting Q value, and then adjust that until the average energy matches. And the tables that we used, so we used the classic Fuller-Fowler-Newman, and then some updated rates from these two papers here. And these are the same rates that our stellar evolution code MESA was using. So we were able to make sure that the rates that we calculate match the MESA rates and also match these tabulated rates. So everything matched over all the possibilities. So once we find the Q value for one isotope, we do it then for all the isotopes that are there. We used this MESA 204 net, so there are 204 isotopes from protons and neutrons up to zinc 66. And then we combined all of the spectra using a weighted sum. So this shows the top 7 or 8 isotopes present in the inner 2 solar masses of the 30 solar mass star half an hour before collapse. So you can see it's lots of iron, which makes sense. But there are, obviously, there's 204 potential isotopes present there. So we combine them using this weighted sum, where xk is the mass fraction, ak is the mass number, and phi k is the combination of the beta decay and the capture spectra. So this big phi is the total spectrum of decay and capture. So now we'll get into some results here. We can look first at the emissivities versus the radius. So again, emissivity is the energy released as neutrinos. And we're looking at the total emissivity from all processes, so the beta processes plus all of our thermal stuff. The dark blue is time 1, which is this onset of oxygen burning for both stars. And then as you can see that as time goes on, so times 2 through 5 are later times, the emissivity grows in both cases. Over here is the core, and you can see that in the core, the emissivity is high, and then as you get out of the core, it drops off quickly. And you see basically the same features in both cases, where high in the core and then it drops off, emissivity increases over time. This is what we expect to see. So nothing really surprising here to compare between the two stars. We can look at the emissivity integrated over the entire star and compare our different models. So these lines are just connecting points. They aren't actual calculated curves. But you can see that the 15 solar mass star here is this dark blue, and the 30 is the magenta. And you can see that the magenta curve from the largest star is not always the largest emissivity. So this reflects kind of the complicated nonlinear nature of the stellar evolution. A lot of parameters in these stars don't just follow monotonically with the mass, and we're seeing that here with the neutrinos as well. But they all do follow basically the same trajectory, where they start off low and go high, which relates back to that initial graph, which showed the large increase in neutrinos leading up to the supernova. So the big thing we were looking for was actual spectra, because we need to know the spectrum to look at potentially detectability. So here we've got spectra at 3 different times for our 15 solar mass star. The thick lines are for the neutrinos, and the thinner lines are the antineutrinos. The blue is the beta processes, and the magenta is pair. Red and green are photo and plasma, respectively. So the top plot here is at the onset of oxygen burning. Then we have that half an hour before collapse, and then the onset of collapse. You can see that in the early curve here, there's some weird bumps out at higher energies. This is actually from specific electron captures on isotopes around mass number 30. They happen to have the Q values to produce these extra bumps out here, which tells us if we can measure the spectrum accurately here, we could learn something about what's going on inside the star. Half an hour to collapse, and then onset of collapse, you can see the beta curve has smoothed out considerably. That's because as the temperature goes up, the spectrum broadens, and then they all kind of smooth together. Immediately before collapse, the highest beta contributions are from things like iron and cobalt and chromium, which again makes sense because those are they'll have the largest mass fractions in the core. Oh yes, all of these spectra are specifically in the core. So this is our 15 solar mass star, and we can compare that to the 30 solar mass star, which, if you look, not a whole lot of change between the two. Again, we see these weird bumps in the beta, which are again from specific electron captures. And then everything kind of smooths out. Overall, this has slightly higher emissivity than the 15 solar mass model, at these times at least, but not dramatically higher. So again, we see basically the same trends in the larger star as we did in the small one. So one thing we were particularly interested in is which process dominates when. So we're looking at here, these plots are the temperature and the density, and these are profiles of the star at various times, and each curve is shifted upward, otherwise they all lay on top of each other. So if you look at say this curve, this is at the onset of oxygen burning in our 30 solar mass star, and the different colors represent which process dominates at that region in the star. So blue means beta is dominating. There's a couple little red spots in here, which means that photoneutrinos are dominating. And then in the core, we see pair, which is what people were assuming before, was that the pair would dominate. But as we move up in time, we see that in the core, we get this nice island of blue, which means that the beta are the dominant process there. So while just doing pair annihilation was a good first approximation, we really need to include the beta processes in any detectability studies because they are a very important contribution. We see basically the same thing in the 15 solar mass star up here. So these on the left side are the total emissivities. We also looked at the emissivities just above 2 MeV. So that's our sorry, that was our cutoff for what we decided would be potentially detectable neutrinos. Inverse beta decay, I think, has a threshold of 1.8 MeV. So 2 MeV seemed safe. So you can see that we see basically the same thing where there's lots of beta and pair, but you can see that the beta dominance extends farther into the center of the star. So the core is over here, and outer reaches out at lower densities. The beta processes in both the 30 and the 15 solar mass star extend way farther in to the core. And since we know that as you get closer to the core, the emissivity goes up, that means, again, including the beta processes in these calculations and looking at detectability is very important, especially at immediately before collapse in this top curve in both cases. And the same thing was seen in the 20 and 25 solar mass star, where basically you get beta and pair and a couple little spots of photoneutrino dominance in the total, but for the above threshold, it's all beta and pair. So, wow, this went a little faster than I expected. So that's what we've done so far. What we're working on now is looking at detectability specifically. So previous studies looked promising, and they were just looking at the pair annihilation neutrinos. So those calculations, those kind of calculations need to be done again, including these beta processes, because we know that from what we have done so far, that the beta neutrinos dominate late in the evolution, especially in the core, and they seem to have higher energies, so that makes detection a little bit easier. And we also need to include oscillations, just so we have the correct spectra at Earth. So this is what we're working on right now. Hopefully that paper will be done relatively soon. And then in future, there are other processes that could be included as well. So in particular, there are more nuclear processes like neutral current de-excitation that produces pairs of neutrino-antineutrino pairs. So this is interesting because these processes tend to create even higher energy neutrinos on the order of like 5 to 10 MeV, which again is very promising for detection. This is a hard calculation to do from what I understand, but it would be a very interesting addition to our spectra because again, we really want to see these higher energy neutrinos because they're better for detection. So just again, to wrap up, we found that the beta processes dominate in large portions of the star in late evolution, especially in the high emissivity core. So including these processes is very important for studying these pre-supernova neutrinos, and including them could make detections more plausible. So we're working on these kind of detectability studies now, including oscillations, and then for the future, we're looking to potentially add new processes into our calculations and into our spectra. So just want to say a quick thank you to my co-authors, mainly Celia Lunardini at ASU, who was my advisor, and then Rob Farmer and Frank Timmis, who helped a lot with the MESA work. And thank you to all of you for listening.
So thank you very much for that nice talk. As usual, there is some time for discussion, so please indicate in the chat if you have any questions.
Question. Can I go first?
Okay, go ahead.
So I know for, so LIGO has an alert system. When they see a neutron star in spiral, they're going to notify like electromagnetic follow-up telescopes and so on to find the kilonova. Do you know is there any system in place that if a neutrino detector sees such a possible pre-supernova signal that they could send out alerts to either telescopes or maybe even LIGO if there's a chance of seeing the supernova close by?
Right, so that would be ideal. In the near term, that's probably not going to be possible. As of now, what would probably happen is you'd see the supernova burst, which there is an alert system for, I believe. And then you'd go back and look in the, half a day before the burst showed up, and maybe you'd see a buildup of these neutrinos. But I think at this point, it's not something that necessarily the detectors would know that's what was going on at that point. Hopefully, at some point in the future, it would be set up so that you see this buildup happening, and you can say, "Oh, look, there's a supernova about to happen. Everybody, turn your telescopes there." So obviously, that's what we really hope for, but at this point, it's probably not possible.
There was another question from Notre Dame.
I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly. So I'm aware of some studies where they've looked at different neutrino interactions in the core, like for example, if there's a sterile neutrino present, or if they're adding chiral effective field theory in there to get more exact neutrino interactions in the core. And my understanding from some of those studies was that it changed the spectra in the core quite a bit, but once you get further out in the regions of the star, you just couldn't tell any differences. You're saying with your, I don't know, more exact studies of the regular processes, not, you know, steriles or anything, that you could, in principle, maybe tell a difference in the spectra as detectors?
Yeah. So yes. So if you integrate over the volume, you obviously are going to lose some of the more interesting things, like those weird electron capture bumps, stuff like that. That's going to get diluted. So that's part of what we're working on now, is to see just how much that's diluted over the star.
Okay.
And that's kind of ongoing right now. We know the spectra that I showed are specifically just in the core, and we haven't looked at what happens as they travel out and the oscillations and all of that quite yet.
Okay. I have another question, if that's okay. That plot that you had of emissivity, where it was the big Q, the total emissivity, could you go back to that? There's some interesting bumps in there.
This one?
No, one back.
Here?
Yeah. Wait, where you're getting further out, like from the core, there's some really interesting, like, steps, it looks like. You see these sudden uprises at certain radii? What are those from? Are you hitting the neutrino radius there? Or the neutrino sphere radius, or what's happening there?
So this is all these neutrinos at this point. Nothing is blocked. They all just free stream out. So there's nothing like a neutrino sphere or anything like that. These are really just edges of shells in the star.
Okay.
So like this is basically, in this magenta curve here, this is the core, and then you hit the edge of the core and go into a shell. And there are actually, if you look at kind of temperature density plots and things like that, you can see some of these features in those too. And it also shows up in the neutrinos, which is kind of cool, I think. But
okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, if there are more questions, just go ahead.
Wait, we have another question.
Just follow up on observation. So the distances you mentioned were all like kiloparsec or a few hundred parsec. So I'm assuming that this pre-supernova signal would only be visible with current or sort of near-term future detectors within our galaxy. Is that right?
Yes. So a lot of the studies that I've seen for these pre-supernovas kind of take Betelgeuse as the standard to look at, which is 200 parsecs away, so very close. The original study on these looked at 1 kiloparsec, so that's a little more optimistic. But yeah, it would definitely be in our galaxy, and with next generation kind of hyper K size detectors.
Thanks.
Okay, if there are no more questions, then let's thank the speaker again. And I hope to see you all next week, or actually in 2 weeks.